Good morning, everyone. And we are starting the last day of this doctoral seminar of the um, Charles V European Award, Angela Merkel, The Fortune of Being Together, Securing and Strengthening Europe's Cohesion. We have a very intense day ahead, but I'm sure it will seem light because all presentations will be very interesting. In this first part of the morning, we will focus on the role of media from different viewpoints. And we are going to see how this can contribute to European cohesion. We will start with Felipe Núñez Sánchez, and the panel will be chaired by Karen AÑANOS. She is a professor of international law at the University of Granada in Spain. I have had the pleasure of knowing her in this seminar. Prior to this, we had been exchanging emails. She is someone who is very close to the foundation. She has participated in different activities, particularly in the field of EU-Latin America relations. She comes from Peru, so for us, she is an ambassador who has joined the foundation. So thank you, Karen, for being part of this jury. Thanks for being here with us. Without any further ado, you have the floor, Karen. Good morning, everyone. I want to make the most of this space to thank the Yuste Foundation and its director, Juan Carlos Moreno, as well as the whole wonderful team that composes the foundation. Thank you very much, Miguel, for your contribution. I think we all agree that the hospitality has been wonderful, all your management, all your work, you made our stay here much more pleasant. It is wonderful to be able to enjoy this paradise. I would move here with my computer, that's for sure. Thanks to all the team. Thanks to the directors, Professor Teresa, who's about to arrive, I'm sure. Thanks, Jürgen. Thanks, Juan Carlos. Thanks to all this team that made this possible. Thank you very much. For me, it is a great pleasure to introduce this morning a topic that can be addressed from different viewpoints. I'm a lawyer, but the work that your colleague Felipe Núñez Sánchez is going to present will give us a whole new perspective that I find absolutely interesting and very pertinent and very fundamental, because we are facing a real problem that is climate change. It's a world global problem. It is a climate catastrophe that we don't want to see, and it affects us all. It's not a matter of countries, it's not Latin America, Europe, no. It is a global problem that is there in the 2030 agenda. In this context, Felipe Núñez will introduce his work connected to climate disinformation. I think it is very important and very interesting. I want to introduce Felipe, who is a PhD student. He's researching in the field of media in the University Carlos III, Madrid. He is a recipient of an FP1 scholarship. He's working in the field of the Jean Monnet chair, and he's researching how the media impact on the public perception of media and climate change. His research focuses in the intersections between political polarization, disinformation, and the role of media in the creation of social attitudes, particularly in the context of the European Union. The work Felipe is going to introduce is called Media, Climate Polarization, and institutional trust in Europe, the impact of skepticism manufactured in the European Union. Felipe, you have the floor.
Vale.
Professor AÑAñOS, thank you very much for your kind words of introduction. I would like to start by expressing my gratitude to the Yuste Foundation for having given me the opportunity of share these days with all of you, listening to the fascinating presentations by my colleagues. During the days that I have been here listening to the presentations, I was thinking and feeling proud. I was feeling very proud about introducing my thesis here in Extremadura, which is my home region. It is the first time that I am going to be able to introduce my work here in the region where I was born. I was looking at the flag of Extremadura, and I felt that this was a very good example to get started, to talk about the topic that I am here to share, because I think that identities matter. And what matters the most is that they depend on the context. They can activate in certain times, and there are contexts where they're more relevant than others. This long title is something that I will break down based on the concept of identity that can bring together the whole meaning of the title. But before anything else, I will start with a brief story. This is a story that has to do with the evolution of environmentalism and how this social, scientific, and political current crystallizes in institutions. It all starts with an environmentalist whose name was Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was a biologist who was in charge of preserving the environment. Her background and her empirical vision and her coordination with other researchers made her discover that, in a way, insecticides that were being used, BDTs, were impacting negatively the environmental the environment and human health. Carson wrote an essay in the New Yorker, and this essay was published with the title of Silent Spring. Carson's relevance comes from the fact that for the first time she was able to connect the protection of the environment with human health. She tried to transmit technical language and disseminate it among the population, citizens. She did so in the media, and thanks to reaching the media, she was able to be the catalyst and create a movement that was, for the first time, able of thinking collectively on how to get organized in the face of this situation. This happened in 1962. That's when the book was published. During those years, the historic context was very complicated. We could mention events like natural disasters. So we see how in the media these narratives started crystallizing, and that together with these natural catastrophes, started raising awareness among the citizens. Here we have an oil spill in Santa Barbara in California in 1969. The picture on the left shows a chemical spill in Seveso in Italy. The picture here in the left was the source of the Seveso doctrine on the regulation of this sort of products. Here, in the right, we have a picture that I find very interesting because it is about how the media uses events to turn them into something mediatic, to form a public opinion. This is 1970, Earth's Day. For the first time, April 22, 1970, that was the first time that this day was celebrated. It has to do with honoring an event. It is about wanting to be part of an environmentalist group. The organization of this event has to do with a large communication campaign organized by the Democrat Senate member whose last name was Nelson. He wanted to create public opinion to send a message to Washington. And the message was that the public opinion was ready to accept an environmental agenda, creating these days, the day of the Earth, the Environment Day, can be analyzed from the perspective of a social event, something that wants to be remembered. But it can also be perceived from the media as a media event.
It's the capacity to praise or to highlight something in the media agenda, something to talk about. So the impact of like embedding this type of events in the agenda is this. When the population is most concerned about climate change is on April 22nd every year. So this is used, for example, for political lobbying, for teaching purposes, or simply for people not to forget that this is a threat and that something must be done about it. The role of the European Union in this case is different. We've been talking about the United States. There was like a proto-environmental movement that keeps consolidating, but the European Union, since day one, since the foundational treaties, well, we know the Euratom, the Steel and Coal community that were created around energy. But we don't explicitly have any references to the environmentalist world. Only in 1972, the first Stockholm Conference was created. It was the first international conference, and that is when the European Union started to show a more active role. And then it was consolidated in the 90s. After the Treaty of Amsterdam, which is for me a big milestone, it's when the European Union joined the Kyoto Protocol and adopted a more active role. After the Treaty of Amsterdam, the European Union decided to include the environmental policies cross-sectionally in all policies of the European Union. Within this configuration of institutional and political actors, I want to stress something that is Very important. I'm referring to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the scientific and political institution that also represents the civil society, and determines the collection of scientific evidence on climate change. The IPCC expresses the transition from the normal science, as dubbed by some authors. The Kuhnian paradigm says that science is based on paradigms. If something is settled, we can say it's a normal paradigm. Only when the settled paradigm, when the established paradigm is challenged, there is some commotion, and then the science tries to find a new paradigm. And so some authors say that now some contexts explain that we are living in a post-normal science, because science also studies very uncertain situations with not only scientific matters. I'm talking about situations where there is science plus social factors plus political factors altogether. So the IPCC's basic function is to draft reports, to provide consultancy services or advice to governments and institutions. It also measures the effects on the climate in our planet. For instance, there is a very popular report that they published in 2008, because it undoubtedly says that climate change exists. It undoubtedly, human beings are the main factors for that climate change to happen. So it's an anthropogenic climate change. So the consequences had some political dimension, but also for the civil society. It also determined the future of the scientific research on climate change, and also the way the public opinion perceived climate change. So you see, after 2007 or 2008, you see that communication about climate change changed. This graph is for communication purposes, but it also happens in any other science. 2007 was the year where Al Gore and the IPCC received the Nobel Award. So that the IPCC saw a recognition of their dissemination work because they popularized this scientific evidence. You remember that Al Gore was one of the candidates ran for the presidential elections back in the day, and he also is the author of An Inconvenient Truth, a documentary film that you have probably seen. And it was a mass phenomenon for the popularization of the theories of the climate change. Now I want to talk about my theoretical framework, the way I want to theoretically study this topic, and you will understand why the Extremaduran flag is so important for me. We need to talk about the group dynamics, why groups are important, how groups are configured, how the group's identity is created. The importance in a group is that human beings tend to organize the information based on differentiation and belonging processes. So we organize the information like in a group. This is quite a generic definition of a group. A group of people is a set of people that have shared objectives and that have functional actions. And for example, the family is a group, or for example, another group is a set of people that maybe don't have any common traits, but that momentarily or temporarily are acting together in synchrony. So now I want to focus on categories, groups that are formed based on certain specificities or features that they share, shared by the members. And I want to talk about the paradigm of the minimum group by Henry Tafel. According to this paradigm, groups, even when they are created by arbitrary reasons and in a certain context, determine the identity of those who made it. So I'll give you a very simple example. If there is a people in a village that felt they were part of a village, but imagine a river appears between, a river starts flowing through the middle of the village. It can create a segmentation between the population that is left on the left bank and on the right bank. And we'll see whether they still see themselves as a group, as a village, or if they see themselves as opposed to the ones living on the other bank. And I will be using two theories. The theory of the social identity, coined by Henry Tafel and John Turner, and the theory of the self-categorization that goes one step beyond. The theory of the social identity means that people categorize themselves in a group. By comparison, they compare themselves with others and they try to keep their self-esteem in a positive way. For example, I want to belong to a group that keeps my self-esteem positive. So if I compare myself to another group, if my group receives a positive assessment, then it reinforces my self-assessment. If my group receives a negative assessment, a negative rating, then I use mechanisms to cope with that. For example, these mechanisms are the restoration strategies. Mobility, I might go to another group, or maybe creativity. I might reassess my thoughts about that group, or competition. For instance, I might try to do something better about my group. I want to change the structural dynamics of my group so that it's better than the other group. The problem with this theory is that something is missing in there. When we use it on empirical studies, it explains very well what happens when I am part of a group, but it doesn't explain why sometimes I feel determined my nationality. In some of the cases, nationality is not something that I care about. It's not my main identity, because in certain contexts, my main identity is only based on my group of friends or or the people that surround me. So the big idea here is that identity is a situational thing. The characteristics that will be forming my identity depend on my interactions or where I am and when that takes place. So that's why Turner coined the self-categorization theory. It says that people have cognitive representations that tend to be plural. We don't have just one representation, but several. And then that they determine who I think I am, my self-concept. And those cognitive representations are established by the principle of the meta-contrast principle. The principle of meta-contrast. It means that I compare myself with others, with other groups, and then I need to find the group that is most similar to me. If I find similarities, I feel I belong to the group I belong to, and then I separate myself. I set myself away from the groups I don't think I belong to. And this is the despersonalization principle. It sounds very solid or robust or adamant, but it doesn't mean it is not negative. I'm not losing my personal identity. It means that I am adopting a temporary stance to be part of a group, to be able to accept their behavior, the rules. And the consequence, according to Turner and others, is that when I feel I belong to a group, when I have the group identity on, my personal identity is kind of in the background, is left in the background. That is what they call the depersonalization. And then social identity and communication. It's been used in communication studies by taking into consideration that a personal identity is based on communicational dynamics, based on communication phenomena, both personal phenomena, interpersonal phenomena, or even the media. The interesting thing here is that this personal identity also filters the way we perceive the information or how we process it. The identity we use determines the way we perceive, understand, and manage the information in order to be able to make decisions. According to the literature, our identity makes us be prone to favor the information that is more positive for our group, not for a bias, not because we are biased, but because of efficiency, for efficiency reasons, for a fast decision making process, or for coherence purposes, or pragmatism. The problem is that sometimes when we've made a decision, when we are faced with a fact, with a scientific information based on evidence, we don't want to change our decision. Even if we see the facts, we don't want to change our decision. And this has to do with the decision-making process. It is based on social psychology, on heuristic, based on bias. You see the image on the bottom left. This is high bias, but not randomly, but predictable. When we use a shortcut to make a decision, we are biased. We're not being fully rational, as you can see here on the top left. We are making mistakes. We are deviating from the rational targets, but they are predictable. Human beings always fail in the same place. And this is important for political campaigns, for the risk communication campaigns, for behavioral campaigns. So if we identify ourselves with a group, we take a shortcut when we want to make a decision. If, for example, we belong to a group that has a healthy behavior, since I am in that group, I will tend to adopt a healthy behavior too. This was studied in the Brexit campaign, in the aftermath of the Brexit. It was seen that people process political information in an automatic way if it's labeled as an ideology that is close to their behavior. So the information we receive are not processed in a neutral way or in a homogeneous way. So what about climate change and all this? Communication, the field of communication, the studies of social identity do not pay attention to the thing that I have just explained and how we receive information. We pay attention to the media and the people working in the media. That means the creators of the message, or the transmitters, not the receivers, but the transmitters. And many academic papers have not studied this theoretical framework. Those who have one use framing, just framing, how we frame the information to present it to the public, to the audience. And as for the methodology, most of the papers use the content analysis. How information is communicated, how the information is framed, and they analyze the contents with a processing mechanism. For example, term matching. This is relevant, and this is very solid and very robust. We have very solid and robust results. And the consequences or the conclusions is that in the United States and in Spain, there are many ideological biases in how the information is presented. For example, conservative media are hesitant or reluctant to present information on climate change, and progressive media are alarmist or supportive of the climate change policies. And then we also need to talk about the importance of media coverage, the media peaks. For example, there is media coverage around the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations, the annual meetings that take place on the stage, the situation of the climate, and for example, World Environment Day, Earth Day, and things like that. And I have reviewed the literature and identified several task forces or research groups that study climate change. And these are the most relevant authors. All these authors are relevant, but these are the most prominent authors, the leaders in this kind of studies. So this is Anthony Leserowitz from Yale University. He's the leader in this kind of studies. This group originally studied how media covered climate change news, how information is transmitted, conveyed. But they also studied the other side, how information was received or perceived. So they targeted the audience based on climate identities, how people receive the information heterogeneously and how they use it. So in Spain, this audience segmentation, audience targeting has not been used. But because the population is seen as something homogeneous. But a recent report used a different theory, not the social identity theory that I just talked about. And reached a conclusion. There is a basic foundation, a basic consensus, but people kind of disagreed with the public policies. And there is something I want to highlight about this study. Public policies or public political campaigns to, for example, reduce the amount of meat people eat or reduce the use of diesel vehicles. They do not mobilize people politically in a general way. But if people perceive there is an ongoing political campaign by a specific political party, then they mobilize. So theoretically, we've seen that groups revolve around identities, right? So in the methodology, I want to identify those groups. And this is a marketing thing. This is used for market targeting or market segmentation, and it comes from 1954. This is way before the identity theory. And it has to do with how different groups can be segmented so that you can market your products better. But it can also be used for communication purposes. You can target your message to certain groups in different way. Because if you target your message, you will find more impact in the groups that are prone to receive it better. But this is like a double-sided sword, because you can also treat people as a group instead of individually, and that can have bad consequences, but it's widely used. And for instance, it has been used for housing policies. You have disposable income on one side and then home age. And you can see the effect of a public policy. For example, in this housing example, you can see how different people will perceive a public policy, for example, to incentivize the renovation of a home, and how people will react to the state giving money for a renovation. And for example, the same was done in America. There is a theory, it's called the Six Americas. And regarding climate change, we have like 6 types of people. The people alarmed about climate change, or on the other side of the spectrum is the people that are dismissive. And that doesn't mean they deny the existence of climate change. It's different. Okay, so now I'm moving on to the outcomes. Based on this tool, the Six Americas, I wanted to have disaggregated data. So we sent a request and we got the results. See Europe, look at Europe. For example, the question was whether people believed in climate change. And you see that in Europe, most people do believe climate change exists. The next question is if they think that climate change is caused by human beings. And you see that Europe is the region where most people think the climate change is anthropogenic, or at least it is the result of a combination of human and natural factors. But if you see the details country by country, you will see that some people or some countries mostly think this is an anthropogenic climate change. And look at the top countries in the Mediterranean. So you see that in principle, this determines that you might think these will be the countries that will suffer the effects of climate change the most because of the heat waves. Maybe they feel more adamant on that.
Here in Spain, you can see here that it's the first country in this list. When we ask in Spain whether people believe that there is an agreement on this, people say that 60%, that is the first three bars, people do not think that there is any consensus. That's the first thing that I want to highlight. There is a problem, a grassroots problem, because we do not acknowledge that we agree on something fundamental, that is the origin of climate change. We don't agree on that. So if we are asked individually whether we believe it, we have a position that is close to the scientific position. But when we are asked whether there's agreement, we say that there is not, or we don't believe that there is. So in Spain, there is a polarization on how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive others. Regarding the distribution of these groups of concern, shows that the concern level in Europe is lower than in the previous graphs. We are fourth in terms of how many people are alarmed or concerned about climate change. This may be due, as we have seen in the facts, not because there's a disdainful attitude, or it may be more about thinking that we are already doing everything in our hands, or in a more negative view, we may be concerned, but we feel that it's not something that is going to affect us imminently. This is one of the main reflections that I would like to discuss with you, because when it comes to talking about the situation of alarm in the face of the risk, this would be something interesting to discuss. I was saying here, Spain, within the Mediterranean countries, rates very high in terms of climate alarm. So what do? We get funding from the Jean Monnet Chair, and in the Carlos III University, we repeated this interview to classify the Spanish population. As you can see, the results are very similar to the ones in 2002 carried out by Yale University. So what we do is to create this cluster that we already had, and we cross-reference these variables with aspects that have to do with media and trust in public institutions. That's when we go into the political realm. We talked about the clusters, and we said how in America they identified 6 groups: alarmed to disdainful. Other countries used this same tool to classify population. For example, in Canada, they identified 5 groups, not 6. In Germany, they identified 5. There is a research in Korea. When other countries use this tool, they find that it is an optimal classification tool, but maybe in some countries believe that in their national environment, they may not see 6 groups because there's no such polarization as in the US. So we wondered, what happens in Spain? Do we really have 6 groups? And what we realized is that no, there are no 6 groups, there are 4 groups. The most optimal way of classifying the groups is creating 4 categories. And I gave them similar names to the ones in the previous studies. The categories receive similar names. There are different ways in which this could be classified. I did a latent class analysis. This has to do with things that can't be measured directly, like the perception of danger of climate change. We can't measure that directly, but we can use certain variables, the questions that we established in the beginning. So we have groups of questions, and we isolate that variable, and we isolate the groups. Here is the distribution of groups. We have the intermediate groups that I classified, as we can see here. The second on the right for you, I refer to them as unsteady or hesitant. Then another aspect is about the trust in these groups when asked about the verification activities in the media. We can see that there's a very linear relationship here. We have groups that identify themselves as highly alarmed by climate change, and they think that the verification work of the media is more effective. And this applies to the trust they have in traditional media. There's a linear relation between people who believe that climate change is an imminent concern, or people who are at least concerned about this, and the view that they have of media and how media inform, how much these groups trust the media. The same applies to the European Union. We see the same linear relations. Groups that identify themselves with alarmism or environmental concern are more in favor of the EU activities. And the groups that are more dismissive have a lower opinion of the EU activities. So we provide a context, and we connected with the political actions of the European Union and how this is perceived by the Spanish citizens. And we connect this with the role of conspiracies. Sometimes there are elements that we see as something in our daily lives. I'm going to give an example. For example, when there's criticism to the European Union and the 2030 agenda, there are these conspiranoias and how supranational institutions to uh, want to not let citizens know about what's happening, or that the European Union is trying to limit freedom and is trying to intervene in individual freedoms of population in connection with conspiracy theories. So these connections of and trust brings me to coining skeptical alliances between different variables that have to do, that may seem like they're not related, but they come hand in hand. This is what I refer to as conspiracy alliances. This is all I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much, and I'm here looking forward to our discussion.
Pues nada, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Felipe. This is a very interesting work. I'm going to make a few suggestions. I read your work, and I would have liked to hear more things in your work, because you mentioned some aspects, but there were some others that could have been mentioned in your presentation but were not. I am thinking that all of us here come from different fields of expertise. And for some, it may be hard to follow your presentation. The graphs, the figures, everything that you shared show that there is an overwhelming work behind. Nothing is random. But sometimes part of the work may be lost because of lack of order. I'm presenting this is my objective, this is my methodology, I'm going to use this. And that's how you can take us where you want to take us. I'm missing that pace. Some people can be very brilliant, but may have so much information and may want to say so many things that when it comes to being specific, concrete, go from here to there. So I was missing a connecting thread, just a guiding thread. It's a matter of like small nuances that maybe you could take into consideration, particularly knowing that we come from different fields of expertise. I'm a lawyer, you have colleagues who are architects, doctors, they're journalists. That structure in your work is very important. Other than that, I think that you are bringing information and a vision that is very different than what I have, because I'm a lawyer. And if we all approach this theme, one of the priorities in Europe is the environmental transition. And you can open up the field. This is connected, your topic is connected to many other fields. So here we can talk about reports, we can talk about the legal framework, that evolution in the legal framework, because all of this is connected to this global concern that is reflected in the 2030 agenda, the SDG 13, and there are indicators within that SDG. All of this connects and has to do with the generational shift. I am in my 40s, I will leave it there, in 40s in general. And I feel that the youngest generation, I have a niece who's 24, more or less your age, probably. And I see that she has a different way of perceiving this topic. I feel that these new generations are more trained. 20, 25, 40, 60, 80, people see things in a different way. The environmental impact, sustainability, this garment is not made of cotton, I am going to recycle, becoming a vegetarian, becoming vegan. All of these things are new for many of us. But I feel that the younger generations are more educated. I don't know if I'm a millennial or whatever, the youngest generations. So I feel that they have more education. For example, we have Greta Thunberg. She really is the incarnation of how important this topic is. In my view, there are many things that connect to your topic. And this has to do with everything with climate change. I think we could organize a specific seminar on climate change. And we would start with the impact, with the legal aspects, how this happened, how the European Union has addressed this, what Europe is doing, because you gave evidence of this. You talked about Yale University indicators. Europe is the region that is more concerned about this topic, is the continent that is more concerned about it. There's the green impact, there are European regulations to reduce greenhouse emissions, etc. So, from a legal perspective, things are being done. I don't know if in your work you touch upon Europe, because these aspects, we have this background, we have these instruments, and they have to be mentioned, because you are right. We can give you ideas for another thesis. Each of us can contribute with our own vision, and this can make our work an ending. In a very general way, I don't know what you think about this. Do you think you could tell us more about the relevance of media, if they are an additional power? Can the media impact in population? You talked about an identity approach. How relevant are they? I think, in my view, media can, as you have evidenced this very well, media can not manipulate but guide us, because we have a bias. Humans have a bias. And in connection with climate, well, I don't know if I'm beating around the bush, but I have the feeling that the most polluting countries, the countries that haven't done their homework, I think the information that they're getting may be false. They may be getting false information. Am I wrong? The least polluting countries seem to be more aware, and the information they have is more true. So, what is the role of media? Having seen these facts, what can be improved? What can be done? There is information, it's clear. You have told us about biases. You have told us about how brains work. You are studying behaviors based on facts. So, I don't know if I am being too vague. I'll give you the floor. Thank you very much, Professor, for all your remarks. I loved that idea of organizing this seminar on climate change. I would love to be invited to it. I take note of that initiative. I am happy to have 20 minutes to continue discussing. Your first remark was about countries and the position of Europe. I don't have the presentation here, but what the figures show is that in Europe, there is knowledge that is very much aligned with scientific opinions. And most people think that there's climate change that is man-made or human-made. Can I start with, well, well, the facts, I know them by heart because I've worked on them. So what I want to emphasize is that Europe is fourth in terms of regions. That is, although I want to be careful because it's being recorded but what I want to highlight is that in Europe we are very well informed, but we are not as concerned as other regions that may be much more affected by climate change. I didn't find any result stating that these other countries receive more false information, because the information that we have here, I mean, the position that we have here is very much aligned with the scientific position. Let's see if I can find this slide. Here we have the European position. It ranks first in terms of the existence of climate change. Here we have the effect or the, no, not the effect, the origin of climate change. And this is what I wanted to show. Not as concerned. This doesn't support a skeptic position, but it does reveal that in Europe, there's not such a level of alarm as other regions. Latin America has a different situation. And I want to mention a potential fracture here that has to do with the perception that EU countries have when it comes to this sense of alarm, meaning that political action is necessary. There can be a political fracture here that may. There are countries to the east or to the north that are less affected by climate change. Some of them may be favored by the reduction of deaths due to cold weather, and maybe crops may be expanded. So all in all, climate change creates many losers, but some people are going to win in an isolated way. It's a minority thing, but some regions are going to become warmer, and they may have more fertile soil. So crops may be expanded, and that may be in their favor. So there may be a fracture in terms of perception because of this reason. And if I may, I want to say that this is something that we have to take into consideration. Politically, we need to be aware that the perception on climate change is not the same in all countries in Europe, number one. Number two, population in each country does not receive information in a homogeneous way. We have media, but then we have governments that in their institutional communications sometimes are not aware that there are groups that do not receive information, and sometimes groups that have a skeptical position are treated in a very harsh way, in a very receiving insults. And this is not valid and does not activate what we want to activate, which is the alignment with scientific evidence and the possibility of creating public policies that foster environmental well-being and the well-being of all the population. Are there any more questions? We have at least 4 questions from the audience. We have to go straight to the point. I will give you the floor in the order that you asked for it.
Sí, una cosa. Vamos allá. También quería remarcar.
So I want to highlight that whenever I get the floor, I always say it. What we really need are figures, because the figures that I have worked with coming from a university, I was in the University of Nevada in the US, and they gave me some facts. We carried out a national survey with funding from the European Union. There are surveys, for example, DAFECID, it carries out surveys every 2 years about the perception of science in Spain. And on a European level, this tool is also used in many European countries. There are many surveys, and I think these surveys should be public. Good morning. Very impressive. I can see that you have a background in statistics. You nailed it. I wanted to ask you if you broke down the population by ages, in echoing what Professor AÑAñOS was saying, because there's a generational component here that is very important. We don't understand information in the same way as teachers do. So I don't know if the information was segmented by age. There is a political segmentation. We have people in the left that are highly more in an alarmed position. I use alarm because that's alarmist, because that's the term that is used in the original work, but we're talking about a concern. And women tend to be more concerned. And in terms of age, I was surprised. The older population, I mean, there's not that large difference in terms of concern. However, the youth is significantly lower in terms of uh, in terms of revisionists or deniers. It's not that they're more concerned, it's just that they're more against deniers. They're more against the denier position. Armando Santana from the University of Jaén. Thank you very much, Felipe. I can see that you have an outstanding background, and I can see that probably in 4 or 5 years you will have many more university degrees. It's wonderful to have someone so someone who's so trained with us. There's a movie called Aguas Negras, Black Waters by Mark Ruffalo. It addresses the spills by DuPont. I think this is the only thing that I can share with you because I don't know much about your field, but it's something that I wanted to share with you anyways. A question. In your first slide, you say that the country that has more, that believes more in climate change, or that the area is the Middle East. Maybe I didn't get it right, or I didn't interpret it right. Is the Middle East that is more concerned? Do you think maybe the Middle East region, maybe the territory, why do you think this may be? Why do you think the Middle East rates higher in terms of concern? You mean in the chart by regions? The region that has more, that believes the most in climate change is the European Union, the region. You may be talking about the segmentation, that is the degree of concern. That has to do with regions that have a higher level of impact. There are more climate migrants. Yes, it's very interesting. And the movie that you're mentioning has a lot to do with something that I didn't mention here, but I think is very relevant. It's something that I include in the chapter that I'm drafting now. And this has to do, well, it's something that I didn't want to mention here because I thought I wasn't going to have time, and I almost didn't have time to finish my presentation. I haven't finished the historic context and the evolution of the European Union in the treaties, the European climate law, all of these European legislation is in my work, but I haven't introduced it here in my presentation. There's a concept that is agnotologist. In epistemology, agnotology is the study of ignorance. How ignorance on certain topics can be created. There's a philosopher, Naomi Oreskes, and the concept comes from another researcher, Robert Proctor. And it is about how companies create disinformation campaigns to create counter information regarding scientific evidence. The classical case is tobacco companies that write surveys or reports against scientific evidence. to discredit, for example, the relationship between lung cancer and the consumption of tobacco. So their idea is, if we can't deny it, at least let's create information that raises doubts about scientific information. Naomi Oreskes studied this in climate change, on climate change, and then our think tanks, very powerful think tanks that create a context of polarization that does not really exist. The biologist Rachel Carson, the one who wrote Silent Spring, she received a very harsh attack by pesticides companies in the US. Good news is that her book became really famous, and the laws were changed in the US based on the movement that she created. I don't know what the situation, probably the situation in the US is not that favorable to these things right now.
Hi, Felipe. I'm Ricky Gan from Universidad de Oviedo. I really love your presentation. Because me, myself, we also work in the disaster unit. So I think we are working in the same line where the climate-related hazard disaster as an extreme form of the climate change. And then you and I both, we also work on behavioral aspect. So I guess in the future, probably we would have some opportunity to work together. And what you have presented is just like a music to my ear. It's really good. But I have a suggestion as well as question together. When you are presenting the behavioral, the perception of a different part of the country, I think one important factor is to state the socio-demographic, because we know that, like Nacho has said, different ages have different perception. And I also think that different people who live in different area could have different outcomes of this perception. For example, if you do a survey in Valencia, where a place just suffered from Dana, or when you compare to Asturias, which rains is just constant all the time, but without any disaster, perception outcome will be completely different. And I want to ask you whether you took this into your considerations when you are doing your thesis. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias por la pregunta.
Thank you for the question. I hope I think that we are working on areas that have common grounds, because my group at Carlos III University works on health communication. But now we'll be submitting my thesis very soon, so that will be very tight. But as soon as I'm done with that, I will be happy to collaborate with you. I wish I had data, figures, and especially about how perception changes faced with direct events. For example, the Dana in Valencia. And it would be great to have data before and after the event, but we need money for that. Sometimes it is very scarce, and that's why sometimes we lack the data. But it would be great. Yes. It would be really helpful. Hi, Felipe. My name is Gabriel from Polytechnical University in Madrid. Congratulations. That was a great deal of data. I think I'm going to watch your presentation several times. So from my architectural perspective, I was really interested in the agency of the media to convey that information for solutions or mitigations to the climate change. And how would you see the applicability of your methodological framework to other fields? Because I'd love to have something like you come to our architecture school and talk about the agency and how it can be applied. I was thinking about my presentation like 3 years ago, 3 days ago, sorry. I was talking about the responsibilities on the built land. And well, obviously, after you're done with the thesis and after you have some rest, and after going to Oviedo to talk to Ricky, would you please come over to Madrid so that we can discuss the applicability? Maybe we can learn from each other, from different disciplines, so that we can join our agencies. It's not a question, kind of a reflection. Yes, but thank you for saying that, because I want to further talk about something Professor AÑAñOS said. The social identity is fragmented because within an area, there can be many disparities among the population. So one of the current trends in communication is about the media effects. It's about the media psychology. And this is where I precisely work, in case it wasn't clear yet. So we study the effects of the media. Classic manuals categorize the stages, how media affect the citizens. In the beginning, there was like 2 stages. The harsh one was media determine everything we think about a specific topic. And then the second stage was like, media do not determine everything we think, but opinion leaders like filter or nuance the information, and that's what we get. The third stage was one in which experts thought maybe the media do not determine what we think, they determine what we talk about. This is the agenda setting theory. And then the fourth stage, the current stage, is in one we think, or experts think, that, well, sometimes media shape our opinions, sometimes they don't. There are many other variables. If this happens, they do shape our opinion. If this doesn't happen, they don't shape our opinion. So we have to be cautious when it comes to state how influential media are. Good morning, Felipe. My name is Carlos Barroso from Complutense University in Madrid, the education school. Thank you and congratulations for your presentation. I have a question. Since you work on audience segmentation and audience targeting, when you said that the European Union is the region that is most concerned about climate change versus other big polluters such as the United States, do you think the European Union, when we talk about Agenda 2030, do you think having that segmentation of the population can create a bubble effect? She will be talking about audience segmentation. He will be talking about audience segmentation in his presentation. So that is very interesting. Yeah, so to answer your question, the groups that are similar to each other, if they receive a stimulus, they can have a clear effect, but that bubble effect is not very clear or not very evident. They don't have those echo chambers. 5 years ago, if you've asked me 5 years ago, I would have said that according to the theories, yes, echo chambers were a thing. But for instance, now Alberto Acerbi talks about misinformation with myths, how misinformation affects us is based on myths, because we apparently is misinformation is not a big deal, because misinformation is something that uses former bias to act. It's not that we are completely misinformed. There has to be like a prior condition for misinformation to really work. Thank you. This was a very interesting talk. It's important to be able to see and measure how influential media are. We need to know how pervasive the population layers are. There was a question about age. Those of us who are very old have seen many different climate changes, because when I was younger, the big concern was the glacier era, glaciarization. And all the media talked about how we were going to a new era of glaciers. And now it's the opposite. And then there was the ozone layer. It's glaciation, and then ozone layer, and now climate change. So science sometimes is very badly disseminated. Even if it's evidence-based, it is very badly disseminated because of the ethical reasons underlying the populations. And the more money you spend on information channels, not just the classic media, but all information channels, the more you can shape the public opinion around something. For instance, the European Union has invested incredible amounts of money on this, but I doubt we need so much money so that this maybe we should invest more money on preventing the problem from happening, because those who pollute the most have gotten away. There is the old motto, if you pollute, you have to pay. Forget about it. So, well, but I like your terminology because you can detect the bias. Yes, very quickly. I think we need to insist on how science works. That's why I was talking about post-normal science, because we're working on a research that is based on uncertainty. Look at COVID, for example, the pandemic. We didn't know how science works because scientists said, we don't know how this works. Then the media said, the vaccine will do this. And then people started challenging and questioning. But I thought these scientists said the opposite. How is this going? Why is this? So I think we should teach people how science works and then accept there is some uncertainty level. So thank you, Felipe. I just want to thank you again for this. You have created some hype in here, so thank you. And now we have a coffee break.